They took the house. They took the truck. They took every dollar in the savings account, and they signed her the boat like it was a favour. Take the old tub, Mum, Carl said. Diane and I already split up everything that's actually worth something. Nobody laughed out loud. They didn't have to. The silence in that kitchen did the laughing for them. A boat chained to a rotting pier. A hole nobody had painted in 11 years. A dead man's last joke. Or so his own children thought. Then she found the floor under the fish hold wasn't a floor at all. A harbormaster read a number off that hull. He'd known her husband 30 years. He went very, very quiet. But before the pry bar, before the tackle box wired shut with copper, before a stranger stood up in a folding chair and said one sentence that ended 2 mortgages in a single breath, before all of that, there was a kitchen table, a widow, 2 children who had already decided what their mother was worth. Let me take you back 6 weeks. Carl set the boat's registration papers on his mother's kitchen table. He slid them across like he was doing her a favour. Take the old tub, Mum. Diane and I already split up everything that's actually worth something. Ruth Pemberton didn't answer right away. She looked at those papers the way she looked at a squall line coming in low over the sound. You didn't argue with weather like that. You just watched. You waited to see how bad it would get. That's Dad's boat, she said finally. It's a liability, Diane said. She didn't look up from her phone. The marina wants $400 just to keep it chained where it is. Nobody's going to buy her. Nobody's going to want her. She has a name, Ruth said. Diane finally looked up. It's a boat, Mom. Ruth didn't raise her voice. She never had. Not in 51 years raising these 2. Not in the 11 days since Wendell's funeral. Not now. She reached across the table. She turned the papers so they faced her. She read her husband's boat's name off the top line. Slow, like she was reading a hymn. Constance May. His mother's name. Ruth had asked him once why he never changed it. Something theirs, she meant. Something new. Wendell had said the boat already knew who she was. A man didn't rename a thing that already had a good name. Fine, Ruth said. I'll take the boat. Carl exhaled, like he'd been holding his breath for 11 days. Maybe he had. He slid a second folder towards her. The closing paperwork on the house on Larch Street. Already signed on his line. Waiting on hers. You'll sign this too, he said. It wasn't a question. Ruth signed it. She didn't read past the first page. She already knew what it said. The rest was just lawyer language dressing up the same plain fact. The house was Carl's now. The savings got split between the 2 of them. Diane got a truck out of it. Carl put a down payment on a bigger place in Augusta, one with a 3-car garage and a view of somebody else's lake. Nobody asked where Ruth was going to live. She'd already decided. She was going to live on the boat. It was the one thing that week nobody else wanted. And Ruth had spent 40 years loving things nobody else wanted, starting with a lobsterman from Belhaven, Maine, who couldn't dance and didn't talk much, and smelled permanently of diesel and bait. She'd loved him anyway. Completely. From the first Saturday he took her out past the breakwater and let her hold the wheel. Ruth Pemberton was 76 years old. She'd married Wendell at 22, in a church that had since become a yoga studio. She'd spent every year since learning the geometry of a working harbour. The tides, the traps, the way a rope needed coiling so it wouldn't take a man's hand off when it ran out fast. She could still splice a line faster than either of her children could tie their own shoes. She could balance a checkbook too, 40 years running, to the penny. Wendell had never been any good at numbers. Somebody in that marriage had to be. She kept every receipt, every ledger page. At 76, her memory was sharper than most people's half her age. Ask her what diesel cost in 1987. She'd tell you within a nickel. Nobody in that kitchen thought to ask her anything at all. Carl and Diane left within the hour. Papers signed. Estate divided. Both of them halfway to their cars before Ruth even finished folding the tablecloth. She stood in the kitchen that wasn't hers anymore. She looked out at the grey line of the Sound. She didn't cry. She'd already done all her crying, alone, over 11 days. This house had started feeling like a stranger's the moment Wendell stopped filling it with the sound of his boots on the stairs. She packed one suitcase. She left the good china for Carl. His new wife liked things like that. She took Wendell's oilskin coat off the hook by the back door. It still smelled faintly of him, if you buried your face in the collar the way she did once when nobody was looking. Then she drove down to the harbour. The Constance May sat at the far end of the crooked pier, off Wharf Street, chained to a piling gone grey and soft with rot, behind Ackley's bait shop. In the long shadow the old cannery threw every afternoon, once the sun dropped low enough. She was a 32-foot lobster boat, wood hull, built the year before Ruth and Wendell married. Nobody had painted her since before he got sick. She looked exactly like what Carl and Diane thought she was, a wreck, $400 of chain and dock fees waiting to happen. Ruth stood on the pier and looked at her anyway, the way you'd look at an old dog somebody else had already decided to put down. Well, she said out loud, to nobody, to the boat, to the grey water lapping the pilings. Guess it's just us now. She'd never been the harbour's harbourmaster, not officially, not on any payroll. But she'd spent enough mornings on that pier, over 40 years. Half the working boats in Belhaven had learned her step on the planks before they ever learned her name. She knew which piling was rotted clean through. She knew which ones would hold another decade. She knew Dale Prewitt's schedule better than Dale Prewitt did, because Dale had learned the harbourmaster's trade standing next to Wendell Pemberton 30 years back. Dale was 22 and green then. Wendell had taken him under one weathered arm and taught him how a working harbour actually breathed. Dale came out of his shack when he saw her car. Ruth, he said, and took his cap off. He only did that for two kinds of people, widows and captains. This week, Ruth Pemberton was both. Dale. Heard about the house, he said. Word travelled fast in a town this small, faster than the tide. Heard about the money, too. News gets around. Everything gets around here eventually. Dale looked past her, down the pier, to where the Constance May sat listing gently against her rotted piling. They give you the boat? They gave me the boat. Dale went quiet a moment. He'd known Wendell longer than Carl and Diane had, in a manner of speaking. Carl and Diane grew up mostly on the mainland side of things. School, sports, lives that pulled them further from the water their father never once left. Dale had spent 30 summers on this pier, learning things from a man who didn't waste words. And if there was one thing Dale Prewitt knew for certain about Wendell Pemberton, it was this. The man never did anything without a reason. Not even something that looked, on the surface, like nothing at all. You gonna keep her? Dale asked. Ruth looked at the boat a long moment before she answered. She's got a good name, Ruth said. I'm not selling a good name for $400 in scrap. Dale almost smiled. First thing that had looked like a smile on anyone's face in 11 days. It came from a harbourmaster with no blood claim on Ruth at all. Just 30 years of watching her husband coil a line. Somehow that meant more to her, right then, than anything either of her children had said all week. He kept the mooring paid up, you know, Dale said. Every year, even the last two, when he was too sick to come down here himself. Had me run the fee up to the town office myself. Cash in an envelope. Every February, like clockwork. Ruth frowned. Wendell hadn't mentioned that. In the last 2 years, he hadn't mentioned a lot of things. He was never a man to burden anyone with worry, before it was strictly necessary. By the time it became necessary, most of it was already too late to ask about. Why would he keep paying a mooring fee on a boat that never left the dock? Dale shrugged. Not the kind of shrug that meant he didn't know. The kind a careful man gives when he suspects something and doesn't want to say it out loud before he's sure. Man doesn't keep a mooring current on a boat he plans to let rot, Dale said. That's all I'll say. Ruth looked at the Constance May again. Really looked this time. Past the peeling paint, past the rust streaks running down from her cleats, past everything Carl and Diane had seen when they decided she was worth exactly nothing. Wendell Pemberton never did anything without a reason. She just didn't know yet what the reason was. That night she slept in the boat's small cabin. The mattress smelled like salt and cedar, and faintly, like the man who'd slept there beside her 100 times over 40 years. Back before Larch Street, back when this boat was their only home some seasons, when the traps ran good and the mortgage on land wasn't worth the paper. She lay awake a long time listening to the water slap the hull, a sound she'd fallen asleep to 1,000 nights of her life. Somewhere past midnight, staring at the low cabin ceiling, she remembered something Wendell had said to her once. So offhand, she'd nearly forgotten it entirely. They'd been standing on this same pier, a decade back, watching some summer person try to talk the town into selling harbour frontage for condominiums. Wendell had laughed the short, dry laugh he saved for things he found more sad than funny. Ruth, he'd said, Don't ever let them sell the boat separate from what floats under her. She'd thought at the time he meant sentiment. The way a man says don't let them throw out my old chair. Not because the chair's worth anything, because a life gets attached to objects and you don't want to see it discarded. Lying in the dark, 11 days after his funeral, Ruth turned that sentence over for the first time as something other than sentiment. 6 weeks later, a harbormaster would read a number off this hull and go quiet. What floats under her? She didn't know yet what that meant. She only knew, the way she'd known bad weather was coming long before the sky agreed. Her husband had left her something besides a boat. Whatever it was, he'd hidden it in plain sight, chained to a pier, wearing a paint job so ugly nobody had bothered to look twice in 11 years. In the morning, she was going to start looking. Morning came up grey over the sound. Fog sat low on the water until the sun burned a hole in it, big enough to see past the breakwater. Ruth was up before the fog lifted. She'd been up before dawn for 51 years. First for Wendell's boots on the stairs, then for his coffee, then these last 2 years, for his oxygen machine clicking on in the next room. Old habits don't ask permission before they keep a person moving. She made coffee on the boat's single burner, the same brand Wendell always bought, and drank it standing in the cockpit. She looked down the length of the deck at the fish-hold hatch she hadn't opened yet. 11 years the boat had sat here. 11 years since Wendell's hands got too unsteady for the work. He'd chained her up rather than sell her to some stranger who wouldn't know her name meant something. Ruth had asked him more than once why he didn't just sell the boat and be done with the dock fees. Every time he gave some version of the same non-answer. A shrug, a change of subject. Once just, "Not yet, Ruth. Not yet." She understood now she'd never once asked him not yet until when. She finished her coffee. She knelt at the fish-hold hatch, the wood swollen with 11 winters of damp. She worked the latch with a screwdriver from Wendell's old toolbox until it gave. The hatch cover groaned open. Below it, the hold looked exactly like she remembered. Empty, smelling of brine and rot and old rope. A floor of grey planking that had held 1,000 pounds of lobster in its day, and nothing at all for the last decade. She almost closed the hatch right back up. It was just an empty hold. Nothing here that $400 in scrap value hadn't already accounted for. But she stayed kneeling a moment longer. Something about the floor planking bothered her, the way a crooked picture on a wall bothers you before you can say why. She ran her hand along the seams between the boards. Most of the floor had been laid the same way. Tight-fitted planks running the length of the hold. Honest work. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted. That was Wendell. Except one section near the stern, where the seams didn't quite match the rest. She noticed it. Then she made herself stop noticing it. She had a boat to clean, and a life to figure out. She was not going to spend her first morning as a widow chasing a feeling about floorboards. She closed the hatch. She went up to Ackley's bait shop for bread and milk. It was the only store within walking distance now. She was going to have to learn this new, smaller life whether she liked it or not. Ackley's smelled the way it always had. Salt and diesel and the mildew of a building that had stood too close to the water for 80 years. Old man Ackley had died a decade back. His granddaughter Winnie ran the place now. A broad, quiet woman in her 40s. She'd grown up on this pier the way Ruth's own children hadn't. "Mrs. Pemberton," Winnie said. "Careful. Testing. The way people talk around a woman recently widowed. I was sorry to hear about Wendell." "Thank you, Winnie. Heard you're living on the boat now." Ruth set a loaf of bread and a carton of milk on the counter. "News travels fast." "This is a small dock," Winnie said, not unkindly. She rang up the total. $4.18. Then, before Ruth could pay, she reached under the counter and pulled out a small paper bag, folded at the top. "This came for you. Somebody left it on my counter yesterday evening. Said it was for Mrs. Pemberton, down at the end of the pier. Didn't say who." Ruth opened the bag. Inside was a tin of the good coffee, the kind that cost twice what she usually bought. A folded $20 bill. And a scrap of paper in handwriting she didn't recognise. Small, careful, slightly shaky. The hand of someone old enough that their fingers had started to argue with them. "Thought you could use this. Your husband never let a man leave this dock hungry. Seemed only right. No name." Ruth turned the paper over. Nothing. "Any idea who?" she asked Winnie. Winnie shook her head. "Wasn't here when it got left. Whoever it was didn't want to be thanked, I'd guess." Ruth folded the 20 and the note back into the bag. She carried it down the pier, and for the first time in 11 days, something loosened in her chest. It had been clenched tight since Carl slid those papers across her kitchen table. Somebody out there remembered what Wendell had been to this harbour. Somebody thought the widow, at the end of the pier, deserved a kindness with no name attached. She was going to need that feeling in the weeks ahead. She just didn't know it yet. That afternoon, Dale came down the pier with 2 mugs of coffee and a folding stool. He set the stool down across from where Ruth sat mending a torn line, and he didn't ask permission to sit. 40 years on a working harbour teaches a person that some visits don't need an invitation. "You're going to want to scrape her before winter," Dale said, nodding at the hull. "That paint's not holding anything back anymore." "I know. I can get you a good rate on primer through the co-op. Fisherman's discount." "I'm not a fisherman, Dale." "You've hauled more traps than half the men who call themselves one," Dale said. Not flattery. Just fact, delivered flat and certain, the way Dale delivered most things. Wendell used to say you had better hands for a splice than he did. Ruth's hands stilled on the line. "He never told me that. Man wasn't much for compliments to your face. Told everybody else, though." Dale sipped his coffee. "Told me once Doc's only as good as the person who actually shows up every morning, storm or shine. And that wasn't him half the time near the end. Said that was you." Ruth didn't answer that. There wasn't a way to answer it that wouldn't crack something open in her chest, and she needed it closed a while longer. Long enough to get through the mending, the scraping, the next thing, and the next thing after that. "He kept things from me," she said instead. "Little things. The mooring fee. I don't know what else." Dale turned his mug in his hands. "Man like Wendell doesn't keep secrets to hurt anybody," he said finally. "He keeps them because he's already decided how it's going to come out. He doesn't want anybody worrying about the middle part. That's a generous way to put it. I knew him 30 years, Ruth. That's the only way I ever saw him keep anything." She thought about that the rest of the afternoon, long after Dale went back up the pier, long after the fog burned off and left the Sound sharp and blue under a cold autumn sun. She thought about the floorboards that didn't quite match, about a man who never did anything without a reason, about a sentence he'd said to her once, on this very pier, that she'd filed away for 10 years as sentiment. Don't ever let them sell the boat separate from what floats under her. She went back down into the fish hold before dark. This time she brought a flashlight and Wendell's old pry bar, the one with the taped handle, the one that had lived in his toolbox since before she knew him. She knelt on that mismatched section of planking. She pressed the flat end of the bar into the seam. The board gave more easily than 11 years of saltwater had any right to let it give. Whoever cut that section, and she was fairly certain now it was Wendell, had built it to be found by someone who knew to look, not sealed shut against the world, hidden the way a person hides a birthday present, in a house they know their spouse will search eventually. Not to keep it secret forever, just until the right moment. Underneath the board was a shallow compartment, dry despite the damp all around it, lined with tar paper. Sitting in the middle of it was a rusted metal tackle box, the kind fishermen used for hooks and lures, wrapped twice with a loop of copper wire, twisted tight to keep the lid from springing. Ruth sat back on her heels. She looked at it a long moment before she touched it. Her hands, when she finally reached for the box, were steady. 40 years of tying knots in a rolling sea teaches a person's hands not to shake when it matters, even when everything else in them is shaking plenty. The wire had rusted enough that it broke with one good twist of the pliers. The lid resisted a moment, swollen with age, then came free with a small, tired groan, like it too had been waiting 11 years for somebody to finally ask. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and yellow at the folds, was something flat and rectangular, the size of a folded document. Beneath it, something smaller and heavier she couldn't identify through the cloth. She didn't unwrap either one that night. She sat on the deck with the tackle box in her lap, the last daylight going purple over the water. She thought about a dead man who'd let his own children believe this boat was worthless for 11 years. Whatever was wrapped in that oilcloth, Wendell had wanted her, specifically her, and nobody else, to be the one who found it. She closed the box gently. She was going to need Dale for whatever came next. Whatever this was, it was bigger than a widow, alone on a pier, could carry by herself. Wendell had known that too. Maybe that was why he'd kept the Harbormaster's shack close enough to hear her if she called. But not tonight. Tonight she wanted one more evening of not knowing. One more evening where the boat was just a boat and the box was just a box. The only thing waiting for her in the morning was more of the same quiet, ordinary grief she already knew how to carry. She was wrong about that. She just didn't know it yet either. She waited until morning. Then she couldn't wait one more minute past it. Dale was in his shack by 6, the way he always was. A pot of coffee going. The harbour log open on his desk, the one where he tracked which boats had checked in and which hadn't. An old habit from the days when the harbour still had 40 working boats instead of 11. Ruth knocked on the shack's open door with the tackle box under one arm, wrapped now in a dish towel like something fragile. In a way it was. "You look like a woman who found something," Dale said before she'd said a word. "I need you to look at something, and I need you to tell me if I'm imagining what I think I'm looking at." Dale set his coffee down. He cleared a space on his desk, pushed the harbour log aside. Ruth set the tackle box down and lifted the lid. The oilcloth bundle sat exactly as she'd left it, undisturbed, and beside it the smaller, heavier object she still hadn't identified. Ruth unwrapped the oilcloth first. Her fingers worked the stiff folds carefully, the way you'd handle a bandage you didn't want to tear loose from a wound. Inside was a folded document, several pages, the paper gone soft and brittle at the creases. Clipped to the front page was a smaller item, a metal tag, roughly the size of a silver dollar, stamped with numbers and letters that meant nothing to Ruth. They meant something to Dale, though. His whole face changed the moment he saw it. "That's a keel bolt inspection tag," Dale said quietly. "You don't see those anymore. Yard used to stamp them onto a boat's registered hull number, back when a boat's hull carried more than just her own paperwork." "Carried what else?" Dale didn't answer right away. He picked up the tag, turned it over in his weathered fingers. He read the stamp number aloud, slow like he was making sure he had it right. HN-4417, he read. "Ruth, I need you to hand me that folded document." She handed it to him. He unfolded it with the same careful patience he'd use on a chart he didn't trust. Each page laid flat on the desk. Ruth watched a man who'd spent 30 years reading tide tables and harbour logs go very quiet and very still. "What is it, Dale?" He read the whole first page before he answered. When he finally looked up, his eyes had the particular brightness of a man trying not to let something show on his face, and mostly failing. "This is a harbour grant," he said. 1961. Recorded with the town, filed with the State Land Office. It's the original document that established rights to this pier, this mooring field, the whole stretch of frontage from Ackley's out to the breakwater. Ruth felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear exactly, more like the vertigo of standing on solid ground and feeling it shift half an inch beneath your feet. "Whose name is on it?" Dale turned the page towards her. He pointed at a line near the bottom, typed in the flat official language of a document meant to outlast the people who signed it. "Grant is issued and shall remain appurtenant to the vessel bearing hull number H, N-4417, and to no other party or parcel," Dale read aloud. "That's the language. Ruth, this grant isn't tied to a person, it's tied to a hull number. Whoever holds clear title to the boat wearing this number holds the harbour rights that go with her. The Constance May." "The Constance May," Dale confirmed. Wendell didn't buy harbour rights and put a boat's name on the paperwork as an afterthought. He set it up so the rights in the boat could never be separated. Not by a bank, not by a lawsuit. Dale stopped himself. Ruth heard the rest of the sentence anyway, hanging unsaid in the small shack. Not by his own children. How much is a harbour grant like this worth? Dale exhaled slowly, doing arithmetic Ruth could see moving behind his eyes. "The house on Larch Street, the one your kids took? County assessed that at around $310,000 last cycle. Diane's truck and half the savings. Call that another $60,000-70,000 between the two of them." He tapped the document. "This grant covers frontage rights and mooring fees on 11 working slips, plus first refusal on any commercial lease along that stretch, if the town ever sells development rights. A developer priced out a stretch half this size, 2 towns over last year. Went for just under $900,000. Ruth sat down on the shack's spare chair. Her legs had decided, without consulting the rest of her, that they no longer wanted to hold her up. $900,000, she said, give or take. Depends who's buying and how bad they want it. "And they gave me the boat," Ruth said, half to herself, "because they thought it was worth $400 in scrap." They gave you the boat, Dale said, because nobody bothered to ask what floats under her. Ruth thought of Wendell's voice on this same pier, a decade back, saying that exact phrase like it was nothing, like it was just a man being sentimental about an old chair. She'd spent 10 years thinking her husband was being tender. He'd been giving her instructions. Why didn't he tell me? Her voice cracked on the question. It hadn't cracked once, not at the funeral. Not at the kitchen table when Carl slid the papers across. Not once in 11 days. Dale was quiet a moment. When he spoke, his voice had gone gentle, in a way Ruth had never heard from him before. Not in 30 years of listening to him talk to fishermen about weather and fuel prices. I think he told you the only way he knew how, Dale said. Man wasn't good with speeches, Ruth. You knew that better than anybody. But he kept that mooring current for 2 years, after he could barely walk down this pier. Cash in an envelope, every February. Because as long as that fee was paid, and that boat was afloat, this grant stayed alive. And stayed yours. He didn't tell you because he didn't need to. He built it so you'd never have to ask permission from anybody to keep it. Ruth looked down at the second object still wrapped in the box, the smaller, heavier one she hadn't unwrapped yet. She lifted it out now. She unwound the cloth around it and found a second tag, smaller than the first, stamped with a date. Beneath the date, 6 words scratched into the metal in Wendell's own hand. The same steady, plain hand he'd used to write grocery lists and fuel logs for 51 years. Count the owners, not the pumps. She frowned at it. It made no sense yet. Not in a fish hold on a boat with no pumps to speak of. Dale, reading it over her shoulder, frowned too. That means something to you? He asked. No, Ruth said slowly. Not yet. But something in her chest told her it would. The way a distant sound tells you a storm is still an hour out, but coming. She folded the scrap of metal back into the cloth and set it beside the grant. For the first time since Carl slid those papers across her kitchen table, Ruth Pemberton felt something that was not grief and was not fear. It felt unmistakably like being seen. What do we do with this? She asked Dale. First thing, Dale said, we get this grant recorded properly at the town office. Make sure there's no question about chain of title. Second thing, we probably ought to talk to somebody who knows more about harbour law than I do. He hesitated. Third thing, Ruth. Your children are going to find out eventually. Might be better if they hear it from you, on your terms, than from the town rumour mill. In a place this size, this is not staying quiet past next Tuesday. Ruth thought about Carl's face across the kitchen table, the satisfaction he hadn't quite managed to hide when he handed her the boat like a scrap of charity. She thought about Diane not looking up from her phone. She thought about the 3-car garage in Augusta and the lake camp Diane had already put money down on. Both of them built, she now understood, on the assumption that their mother's share of the estate ended at a rotting hull and a chain. Let them find out, Ruth said quietly. I'm not going to hide what's mine to protect their feelings. I spent 51 years doing that. I'm done. Dale looked at her a long moment. Something like respect moved across his weathered face. The particular respect of a man who'd spent 30 years watching this woman's husband. Only now did he understand the wife was cut from the same cloth all along, quieter about it, no less durable. Wendell would have liked hearing you say that, he said. Wendell would have liked a lot of things he never got around to saying out loud, Ruth said. There was no bitterness in it, only the plain, worn truth of 51 years married to a man who showed love in mooring fees and hidden tackle boxes instead of speeches. A man who'd made sure of one thing. When he was gone, his wife would never again be the last person in a room to learn what she was worth. She left the grant and the tags with Dale for safekeeping. She walked back down the pier to the Constance May in the cold morning light. For the first time in 11 days, she noticed the boat didn't look like a wreck anymore. She looked like a woman had a plan. The Town Hall Records room on Union Street had the particular smell of a place that filed things and rarely revisited them. Dust. Old paper. The metallic tang of a radiator that had been clanking since the Ford administration. Ruth went in on a Wednesday morning, the grant in a manila envelope tucked under her arm like it might blow away. The clerk at the counter was a heavy-set woman named Peggy DeRoss, who'd gone to school with Ruth's own mother. Ruth asked her to pull whatever records existed on Harbour Grant HN-4417. Peggy squinted at the number. She typed it into a computer that looked about as old as the grant itself. Then she went into the back room without a word. She came back 15 minutes later carrying a thin, brittle folder. Her face had the look of someone who'd just found something they didn't expect to find. "This grant's real," Peggy said. "Filed 1961, recorded proper, never contested, never lapsed. Fees current every year, paid in cash, filed under the name of the vessel, not a person. That's unusual. Most grants back then were filed to a landowner. Can you confirm it's still valid? Still tied to the boat?" Peggy checked the ledger pages. One finger ran down a column of dates and fee amounts going back 6 decades. When she got to the most recent entry, she tapped it twice. "Fees current through this February," she said. "Paid same as every year. Cash, under Pemberton. This grant is alive, Mrs. Pemberton. And as far as this office is concerned, it's tied exactly where the document says, to hull number HN-4417. The Constance May. If that's the boat's name, then yes." Ruth felt her hands go steady in a way they hadn't been in 11 days. Not since the funeral, not since the kitchen table, not even in the fish hold with the pry bar in her hand. This was not sentiment anymore. This was not a feeling about floorboards. This was a document, filed and recorded and confirmed by a clerk with no reason in the world to lie to her. It named her, through the boat her husband had loved enough to protect for 11 years, as sole legal owner, of something worth more than everything her children had already split between them. "I want this properly re-recorded under my name as current title holder," Ruth said. "And I want a certified copy for my own records. That'll take a few days to process," Peggy said, "but I'll flag it as priority." She hesitated, glancing down at the old document once more. "Mrs. Pemberton, this is worth having a lawyer look at. Real money attaches to a grant like this. You want to make sure nobody can come back later and say the paperwork was irregular." Ruth thought about Carl's lawyer, the sharp young man in the good suit who'd drawn up the estate papers with such tidy, bloodless efficiency. She was going to need somebody just as sharp on her own side of the table, somebody who owed nothing to her children and everything to getting this right. She got a name from Dale that afternoon, a woman 2 towns over named Corinne Ashby, who specialised in maritime and property law. She'd once untangled a mooring dispute that had run unresolved for 11 years, in under a month. Ruth called and made an appointment for the following week. Word, as Dale had predicted, did not stay quiet past Tuesday. It was Diane who called first on a Thursday evening. Her voice carried that particular brightness people use when they're trying hard to sound like they aren't upset about something. "Mum, is it true you're having some kind of document recorded on the boat?" "It's true," Ruth said. "What kind of document?" "The kind that takes time to explain properly, Diane. I'd rather do it in person. Carl's saying people are talking. Something about harbour rights, something about the pier." Ruth could hear the edge under the brightness now, the same edge that had been in Diane's voice at the kitchen table, saying it's a boat, Mum. The edge of a woman who'd already spent, in her mind, money that wasn't fully hers to spend yet. "Come by the boat Saturday," Ruth said. "Bring your brother. I'll make a proper dinner. We can talk about all of it then." "Is it bad?" Diane asked. And for a moment Ruth heard something in her daughter's voice, almost like the little girl who used to climb into the wheelhouse and pretend to steer. Back before Larch Street, back before either of them learned to measure their mother's worth in dollar signs. "It's not bad, Diane," Ruth said. "It's just true. And it's going to change some things." Saturday came up cold and clear, the kind of autumn day that made the whole sound look like hammered pewter. Ruth spent the morning making a pot roast in the boat's small galley oven, the same recipe she'd made every Sunday for 51 years. Whatever her children were coming to hear, they were at least going to eat properly first. Carl and Diane arrived together, in Carl's car. Ruth watched them come down the pier from the cockpit. She noted the way Carl's eyes moved over the hull, still unpainted, still listing slightly against her piling, looking, to a man who didn't know what floated under her, like exactly nothing at all. "Smells good," Carl said, stepping aboard. There was an awkwardness in him Ruth hadn't seen since he was a teenager. The discomfort of a person who suspects, without yet knowing why, that they've badly misjudged a situation. They ate at the small fold-down table, the 3 of them crowded close in a way they hadn't been in years. Ruth let the meal go a good 20 minutes before she said a word about the grant. A person deserved a warm meal before news that would rearrange their life. There's something your father left me, Ruth said finally, setting down her fork. In the boat, a document he'd hidden. And a note. What kind of document? Diane asked. Her phone sat face down on the table but never quite forgotten. The way a woman keeps a hand near a weapon, even at a family dinner. A harbour grant from 1961. It gives whoever holds the Constance Mays title the rights to this whole stretch of pier and mooring field. Carl set his fork down slowly. The boat you gave her, he said. Ruth watched him do the arithmetic behind his eyes. The same arithmetic Dale had done out loud in the shack days earlier. His face went through several stages fast. Confusion, disbelief, something colder and more calculating that Ruth recognised because she'd raised him and knew every expression he owned. The boat I gave her, Diane repeated slowly. Mom, how much is this grant worth? Enough, Ruth said, that a developer paid $900,000 for a stretch of frontage, half this size, 2 towns over, last year. The silence that followed was different from the silence at the kitchen table 6 weeks earlier. That silence had done the laughing for them. This one did nothing at all. It just sat there heavy and cold while Carl and Diane looked at each other across their mother's small galley table, both running the same math, both arriving at the same conclusion. That's not right, Carl said finally. That's not how the estate was divided. The lawyer said the house and the accounts were the assets. Nobody said anything about a grant. Nobody knew about a grant. Ruth said, Your father made sure of that. Why would he do that? Diane's voice had gone thin and strange. Why would he hide something like that from his own kids? Ruth looked at her daughter a long moment before she answered. Her voice, when it came, was calm in the particular way that comes from having already cried every tear over a question like this. Alone in the boat's cabin, in the dark long before either of her children arrived to ask it out loud. He didn't hide it from his kids, Ruth said. He hid it from anyone who might have tried to take it away from me. He tied it to a boat's hull number, not a person's name. A hull number can't be pressured into signing something it doesn't understand. He built it so nobody could separate it from me. Not a bank, not a lawsuit, not his own children in a hurry to divide an estate. You're saying he didn't trust us, Carl said. I'm saying your father spent his last 2 years too sick to walk this pier some days. He still found a way, every February, to pay that fee in cash so this grant would stay alive. He thought about this longer and harder than either of you thought about a rotting boat. You handed it to your mother because you'd already decided it was worthless. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Outside, the tide had turned. The Constance May shifted gently against her piling, the rope creaking against wood, the only sound in the small cabin. What happens now? Diane asked finally. Her voice had lost all its brightness. Now, Ruth said, I have it recorded properly. I have a lawyer look at it. And then we all find out exactly what your father built. And what it means for the house on Larch Street, the truck, and whatever you two have already put money down on. Carl's face went very still. Ruth watched her son do one more piece of arithmetic and arrive at a number he clearly did not like. The house in Augusta, he said quietly. I put $20,000 down. If the estate's actual value changes. That's a question for lawyers, Ruth said. Not for tonight. But she could already see it. The particular unravelling that happens when two people build a future on a number that turns out to be wrong. She felt something she hadn't expected, watching her own children's faces go pale across her galley table. Not triumph. Not quite pity either. Just the plain, tired satisfaction of a woman who had finally, after 51 years, been counted. Peggy Duros called Ruth herself, 2 days after the re-recording went through, just to say the certified copy was ready for pickup. It wasn't strictly her job to call. Clerks didn't usually phone people about paperwork. I've worked this counter 26 years, Peggy said. Never once processed a grant like this one. Wanted you to know that. Is that good or bad? Ruth asked. Good, Peggy said. Real good. Your husband did something most people don't have the patience for. He thought 60 years ahead instead of 6 months. Ruth thanked her and hung up. She sat a long moment with the phone still in her hand. This was the third stranger in as many weeks who'd gone out of their way to tell her something true. About a man she'd thought, until 6 weeks ago, she already knew completely. Corinne, for her part, had grown almost fond of the case by the time the certified copy came through. The particular fondness a careful lawyer develops for a client who reads every document instead of skimming it. Most people's eyes glaze over by page 2, Corinne told her, the day she delivered the final paperwork in person. You read every line. Twice. 40 years of balancing a fisherman's books, Ruth said. You learn not to trust a number you haven't checked yourself. Your husband would have made a fine lawyer, Corinne said, if he'd had the patience for law school instead of lobster. He had the patience for exactly one thing, Ruth said. Me. Everything else, he just muscled through. Corinne laughed at that, a real laugh. Ruth found she liked hearing it. Somewhere in this whole strange unravelling of grief and money and old secrets, there was still room for that. 2 women sitting in an office, laughing about a dead man's stubbornness. Corinne Ashby's office sat above a hardware store 2 towns over, in Millbridge, a narrow set of rooms with a view of a river instead of a harbour. She read the 1961 grant twice through before she said a word. Her pen tapped a slow, thoughtful rhythm against a legal pad the whole time. Mrs. Pemberton, she said finally, your husband did something I've only seen a handful of times in 22 years of practicing this kind of law. Every time I've seen it, it was done by somebody who'd been quietly planning for a very long time. What do you mean? Corinne turned the document around so Ruth could see the page she was pointing at. Most people, when they want to protect an asset, put it in a trust, or title it jointly. Something obvious enough that a lawyer sees it in 5 minutes during an estate review. Your husband didn't do any of that. He tied a $900,000 harbour grant to a boat's hull number, filed the paperwork under the vessel's name instead of a person's, paid the fee every single year in cash, so there was never a paper trail leading a bank or a court back to him personally. She tapped the folder. That's not sentiment. That's a man making sure this asset could survive anything. A divorce, a lawsuit, a greedy relative, even his own death, without anybody touching it except whoever legally held that boat's title. He never told me any of it, Ruth said. Not once in 51 years. He might have been waiting for the right moment, Corinne said. Or he simply believed something a lot of men of his generation did. The safest way to protect a thing is to make sure nobody knows it needs protecting until it's already done. She tapped the smaller metal tag, the one with Wendell's 6 scratched words. Count the owners, not the pumps. Does that mean anything to you yet? No, Ruth admitted. I've turned it over 100 times. There's no pumps on that boat. Corinne set the tag down and looked at Ruth a long moment. The look of a lawyer who's just noticed a thread and is deciding whether to pull it. Mrs. Pemberton, did your husband ever own anything else? A gas station, a filling station? Anything with pumps? Ruth started to say no. Then a memory surfaced, thin and half forgotten, from early in their marriage, before the lobstering took over their whole lives. His father did, she said slowly. Wendell's father ran a filling station outside of town, back in the 50s and 60s, before Wendell was old enough to take it over. It closed when the highway moved. I haven't thought about that place in decades. Do you know what happened to it? The land, I mean. After it closed, I always assumed it was sold. Wendell never talked about it much, said it was his father's dream, not his. Corinne wrote something on her legal pad and underlined it twice. I'd like to pull county records on that property, if you can give me anything. An address, a name it was filed under. Because if your husband learned this trick, this whole number trick, from somewhere, my guess is he learned it from his own father. If his father used the same kind of protection on that filling station, there may be more here than just the harbour grant. Ruth felt the floor tilt again. The same vertigo from Dale's shack. The sense of solid ground turning out to have more beneath it than she'd ever imagined asking about. You think there's more? I think, Corinne said carefully, a man who protects one asset this thoroughly rarely stops at one. But I don't want to promise you anything until I've pulled the records. Give me a week. Ruth gave her what little information she had. A rough location on the old county highway. Her father-in-law's name. She drove back to Belhaven, turning the possibility over in her mind. The way her hands used to turn over a line, checking every foot for a weak spot before trusting it to hold a man's weight. The week that followed was not quiet. Carl called twice, his voice tight with anxiety. A man watching a financial plan built on $20,000 of earnest money threatened to collapse under him. The house in Augusta had a closing date in 6 weeks. The seller was not inclined to be patient, while the Pemberton estate sorted out an unexpected complication. "Mom, can we talk about this without the lawyer?" he asked, the second time he called. This is getting complicated fast. It got complicated the day your father decided to protect something instead of announcing it, Ruth said. I'm not the one who made it complicated, Carl. I'm just the one who found it. Diane's talking to a lawyer of her own, Carl said, about the original estate division, whether it needs to be reopened. Ruth felt something harden in her chest. Not quite anger, more like the cold clarity of watching a storm you'd already predicted arrive exactly on schedule. Let her talk to whoever she wants, Ruth said. But Carl, hear me clearly. This grant is legally mine. It was mine the moment your father died. It's tied to a boat that was signed over to me. In the estate division you and Diane drew up yourselves. You can't reopen a division to claim something you handed me on purpose, because you thought it was worthless. We didn't know. You didn't ask, Ruth said. There's a difference, and it matters more than you think it does right now. The line went quiet a long moment. I'm scared, Mum, Carl said finally. His voice had dropped the sharp, lawyerly edge it had carried since the boat's true worth became public. Dropped it entirely, down to something raw and young. Ruth hadn't heard that voice from her son since he was a boy, afraid of a thunderstorm. I already signed for that house. If this doesn't work out, I know, Ruth said. Her voice softened despite everything. Underneath 51 years of marriage to a man who protected people by keeping secrets, she'd learned something. Anger and love could occupy the same sentence without cancelling each other out. I'm not trying to ruin you, Carl. I'm trying to be counted. Those aren't the same thing, even if they feel like it from where you're standing. He didn't have an answer for that. She let the silence sit a moment, then said goodnight and hung up. She sat alone in the cabin, listening to the tide work against the hull, thinking about a filling station she hadn't thought of in decades, a father-in-law she'd barely known, a husband who'd learned, somewhere along the way, the surest way to protect the people you loved. Build something so quiet, nobody thought to look at it twice. Corinne called 8 days later. Her voice had a controlled excitement in it, the sound of a professional trying not to get ahead of herself. Mrs. Pemberton, I found the filling station records, she said. It's still there, derelict, overgrown, but the parcel was never sold. It's been sitting in a dormant land trust since 1968, filed under a name I don't think you'll recognise right away. Mrs. Pemberton, I think you need to sit down for this part. I'm sitting. The trust lists 3 beneficiaries, Corinne said. Your father-in-law obviously as founder, a second name I haven't traced yet, and a third name, added in an amendment filed in 1974, 10 years before your husband would have been old enough to file it himself, which tells me somebody else added it on his behalf. Whose name, Corinne? Yours, Corinne said. Ruth Ann Pemberton. Your maiden name, actually. Ruth Ann Colby, filed the year before you and Wendell were even married. Ruth sat very still on the bunk, the phone pressed hard against her ear. She thought about the metal tag scratched in Wendell's own hand. Count the owners, not the pumps. 3 owners. Not the pumps themselves. Worthless now. Rusted into the ground at a station nobody had pumped a gallon of gas from in 60 years. The owners. Her father-in-law, who she'd never really known. A mystery name Corinne hadn't traced yet. And her own name, added a year before her own wedding. A man understood that, even as a teenager. The only way to protect the woman he'd marry was to write her into something first. I need to see that filling station, Ruth said. I thought you might, Corinne said. I can meet you there Thursday. The old filling station sat exactly where Corinne said it would. 3 miles outside town, on a stretch of county road the highway had bypassed 60 years earlier. 2 rusted pumps stood like tombstones in front of a squat cinder block building, whose roof had partly caved in. Weeds grew up through the cracked concrete apron. A faded sign, barely legible, still read, Colby's Fuel Service, the paint gone nearly white. Ruth stood at the edge of the lot. Something strange moved through her. Not quite recognition, since she'd genuinely never been here. Something adjacent to it. The odd sensation of standing in a place that had apparently been thinking about her far longer than she'd ever thought about it. Colby's, she said quietly. That was my maiden name. Colby. I noticed that too, Corinne said, coming up beside her with a folder of documents under one arm. Mrs. Pemberton, I don't think this station was named after your father-in-law's family at all. I think it may have been named for yours. My father ran a filling station, Ruth said slowly. The memory surfaced reluctant and half-buried, the way old memories do when nobody has reason to disturb them. Before I married Wendell, it failed. He lost it in the same highway rerouting that killed most of the small stations out this way. I always thought it was a different property, over near Millbridge. What if it wasn't a different property? Corinne asked. What if your father-in-law and your father knew each other before you and Wendell ever met? What if this station changed hands quietly, between two men who'd both lost businesses to the same highway? In a way nobody bothered to record properly. They walked the lot together, Ruth's boots crunching over broken glass and gravel. At the building's rear, behind what had once been a service bay, they found a door, rusted nearly off its hinges. It led down a short flight of concrete steps into a root cellar the station had apparently been built over. A relic from whatever farmhouse stood on this land before the highway came through. The cellar was dry, cool, mostly empty, except for a single metal filing cabinet against the far wall, its drawers swollen shut with rust. Ruth worked the top drawer with Wendell's pry bar. It screamed open after a long moment of resistance, revealing a stack of yellowed folders, their labels faded but legible. The first folder held old fuel delivery receipts, meaningless now, decades expired. The second held a stack of photographs, a young man Ruth didn't recognize, standing beside the pumps when they still worked. Beside him, unmistakably, a much younger version of her own father. Both men smiling at the camera in a way that suggested friendship, not just business. The third folder held a single document. When Ruth unfolded it, her hands, for the first time in this entire ordeal, were not steady. It was a partnership agreement, dated 1958, between her father, Harold Colby, and Wendell's father, Amos Pemberton. It established joint ownership of the filling station, and, more importantly, the mineral and development rights to the 40 acres around it. Land that was worthless scrubland in 1958. Land that now, Corinne quietly pointed out, sat directly adjacent to a proposed state highway interchange expansion, under discussion at the county level for the better part of 2 years. Two friends, Ruth said softly, staring at the photograph, who both lost everything to the same highway. They decided to protect what was left so their families would never lose it twice. And then, Corinne said, one of their children married the others. Neither of them ever had to say a single word about it, because the paperwork was already doing the work for them. Ruth thought of her own wedding day, 40-year-old pictures, barely browning at the edges. Wendell in his ill-fitting suit. Her own nervous smile. She wondered for the first time whether their fathers had known something the two of them never had. Whether two old friends, both ruined by the same road, had looked at their children falling in love, and quietly decided history would not repeat itself. What's this worth, Corinne? Realistically. Corinne consulted her folder, cross-referencing a county zoning document she'd pulled earlier in the week. County planning suggests the interchange expansion will go through within 18 months. If it does, this parcel's development value could exceed $2 million. Possibly more, depending on how the state prices the easement. Ruth sat down on the cellar's cold concrete steps, the partnership agreement still in her hands. She let herself, for one unguarded moment, simply feel the size of what her husband and his father had built, hidden and protected across 2 generations. Quietly, without a single dramatic gesture, just cash in envelopes and hull numbers, and a filing cabinet in a cellar nobody had opened in 60 years. He never told me, she said again, quieter this time. Not the harbour grant. Not this. I think, Corinne said gently, sitting beside her, your husband and his father built something that only worked because nobody knew to look for it. The moment either of them said it out loud, it became visible to exactly the kind of people who might try to take it. Silence wasn't secrecy for its own sake, Mrs. Pemberton. Silence was the mechanism. It's the only reason this is all still here, untouched, 60 years and 2 generations later. Ruth thought about that a long moment, the cellar cool and quiet around her. Then she thought about Carl's $20,000 on a house in Augusta, and Diane's lawyer, poking at an estate division already legally settled. She understood, with sudden clarity, that the silence her husband built to protect this inheritance was about to end, whether she wanted it to or not. A $2 million parcel does not stay hidden once county planning documents start crossing the wrong desks. They drove back toward Bellhaven as the light went gold and long across the fields. Ruth's phone buzzed twice before they'd gone 5 miles. Both times from numbers she didn't recognize. Both voicemails from local reporters. They'd already heard, through channels Ruth couldn't begin to guess at, that something unusual was happening with the old Pemberton Harbour rights. The third call was from the town clerk's office. This one Ruth answered immediately. The town clerk's office does not call widows on a Thursday evening without a reason. "Mrs. Pemberton," the voice said, careful and formal in a way that tightened Ruth's stomach before the woman even finished her sentence. "I'm calling to inform you that the town has scheduled a public hearing in 3 weeks. It concerns the disposition of derelict harbour infrastructure along Wharf Street, including the pier and mooring field associated with your late husband's vessel. There's a motion on the agenda to authorise sale of that frontage to a private developer. The pier's in disrepair, and the town believes no clear, active ownership claim exists." Ruth gripped the phone tighter. "There is an active ownership claim. I filed the recorded grant myself 2 weeks ago. I see that in the file," the clerk said. "But the motion was filed before your recording went through. Under town code, a public hearing must proceed as scheduled once a motion reaches the agenda, regardless of subsequent filings. You're welcome, of course, to attend and present your claim. In fact, given the value involved, I'd strongly recommend it." Ruth thanked the clerk and ended the call. She sat in the passenger seat of Corinne's car, in silence a long moment. She watched the last daylight drain out of a sky over fields that had, apparently, been quietly waiting 60 years to matter again. 3 weeks, she said finally. 3 weeks, Corinne agreed. "Mrs. Pemberton, I want you to understand something. This hearing is public. Whoever shows up, whoever speaks, whatever gets said in that room, becomes part of the public record permanently. If we're going to settle this once and for all, that hearing is where it happens, in front of everyone who ever doubted what your husband left you." Ruth looked out at the darkening fields, at the road that had ruined 2 families once, and nearly connected them into something larger the second time around. She thought about a harbourmaster's shack, a filling station cellar, a boat with a good name that nobody but her had bothered to read closely enough to understand. "Good," she said. "Let them schedule it. I'll be there." 10 days before the hearing, a nor'easter blew up out of the Atlantic faster than the forecasters had promised. Belhaven spent a Thursday night getting battered. Wind and rain rattled every loose shutter on Wharf Street. The harbour's working boats strained hard against their moorings. Ruth woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of the Constance May groaning against her lines. A sound different from the ordinary creak of tide and rope. Sharper, more urgent. The sound a boat makes when the sea is testing exactly how well she's tied down. Ruth pulled on Wendell's oilskin coat over her nightclothes. She went up on deck into wind that nearly took the cabin door out of her hand. The harbour looked like nothing she'd seen in years. Whitecaps chopping hard even inside the breakwater. Rain coming sideways in sheets that stung any bare skin they touched. Emergency. Down the pier in the wild swinging light of the dock lamps, Ruth saw Dale already out in his slicker, moving boat to boat, checking lines by feel more than sight. "Get back inside," he shouted over the wind when he saw her come up on deck. "This isn't a night to be out here, Ruth. Neither is it a night to lose this boat 2 weeks before I need her to prove something," Ruth shouted back. She went to work on the forward line. Her hands remembered, even after 11 years away from active work on the water, exactly how to add a second wrap around a cleat when a storm meant business. They worked together the better part of an hour, Ruth and Dale, moving between the Constance May and 2 other boats whose owners hadn't made it down in time, doubling lines, checking fenders, doing the plain, unglamorous work that keeps a harbour's boats from becoming a harbour's wreckage. The rain never let up. The wind tried twice to take Ruth's footing out from under her. Twice, Dale's hand caught her arm, before she went down onto the wet planking. "You didn't have to come out for the Talbot boat," Ruth said, breathing hard, once the worst line work was done. They stood together at the head of the pier, watching the storm keep working the harbour. "Wendell wouldn't have let a neighbour's boat go under on a night like this," Dale said. "Man taught me that harbours only work if everybody treats everybody else's lines like their own. I'm not about to forget it now, storm or no storm." Around 4 in the morning, with the worst of the wind starting to ease, Ruth noticed something. It made her stomach drop, even after everything else the night had thrown at her. A section of the pier's outer railing, near the Constance May's berth, had come loose in the wind. One post torn half free of its footing, leaning out over black water, still chopping hard enough to swallow a grown man without much trouble. That railing's been rotten for years, Dale said, following her gaze. Town's supposed to fix this whole stretch. Keeps getting pushed back a budget cycle at a time. If that post goes, somebody's going in the water, Ruth said. They lashed it as best they could, a temporary fix that would need real repair once daylight came. Ruth stood there afterward, soaked through, shaking with cold and adrenaline both. She looked at a pier that had almost claimed somebody's safety the same night she was fighting to keep it out of a developer's hands. This is what I keep telling people, Dale said quietly, wringing water out of his cap. This harbour's not some line item on a budget spreadsheet. It's real. People's lives run through it every day, storm or shine. Coastal Vista's going to put up a marina with a restaurant and a gift shop and charge $40 to launch a kayak. They're not going to fix a rotten railing at 4 a.m. because a neighbour's boat might go under. Ruth thought about that a long moment. The cold was finally working its way into her bones, now that the adrenaline was fading. You've thought about this a lot, she said. More than just tonight. I've thought about it every night since that hearing got scheduled, Dale admitted. This job's not much of a job anymore, Ruth. 11 boats, a dying trade, but it's the last piece of this town that still runs on people looking out for each other instead of a balance sheet. I don't want to see that go, whatever happens to your grant. They went back to their boats as the sky began, reluctantly, to grey toward dawn. Ruth lay in her bunk unable to sleep, listening to the storm's last gusts working themselves out over open water. She thought about a rotten railing post, a harbour that had almost claimed something precious, the same night she was fighting a legal battle to save it. She understood, with a clarity she hadn't quite had before, exactly what she was actually protecting when she stood up at that hearing. Not a number on a document, not $900,000 of frontage rights, a place where a harbormaster still went out at 2 a.m. in a nor'easter. For a neighbour's boat he had no legal obligation to save. In the morning, exhausted and salt-stiff, she called Corinne and told her about the railing, the storm, the 11 boats that made it through the night, only because 2 people who weren't paid nearly enough to care had gone out into the weather and cared anyway. I want that in the record, Ruth said, not as sentiment, as evidence. If Coastal Vista's argument is that this pier is derelict and poorly maintained, I want the board to understand exactly who's been maintaining it, and why, all these years, the town let the budget lapse. I'll draft an affidavit, Corinne said, from you and from Mr. Prewitt both if he's willing. Sometimes the strongest argument in a hearing room isn't the legal one, it's the human one sitting right alongside it. Dale was willing. He sat with Corinne 2 days later. He gave a careful, understated account of 30 years minding a harbour the town had steadily stopped investing in, an account that made no claim to heroism and needed none. The plain facts, laid out in Dale's flat way of talking, carried more weight than dramatic language ever could. The railing got fixed properly that week too, not by the town, by a dozen harbour residents who showed up on a Saturday morning with lumber and tools. Nobody asked to be paid. Word had gotten around about the storm, and about what almost happened. A working harbour, it turned out, still knew how to take care of its own when it mattered enough. Ruth stood on the newly repaired railing the evening before the hearing. She watched the sun go down clean and orange over water that had, 10 days earlier, come within a rotten post of taking someone under. Whatever happened in that town hall room the next night, she'd already learned something worth more than the grant itself. She'd learned exactly who she was fighting to keep afloat, and it was never really about her or her children, or even Wendell. It was about a harbormaster's shack with the light always on. A dozen strangers with lumber on a Saturday morning. A whole small, stubborn, unglamorous world that ran on people looking out for each other because nobody was going to do it for them. Ruth Pemberton intended to stand up in front of that entire town. She'd make sure it stayed exactly that way for as long as she had breath left to protect it. The 3 weeks that followed moved fast and slow at once. The particular distortion of time that comes when a person is waiting for something they both dread and need. Ruth spent them working. She scraped the Constance May's hull down to bare wood with Dale's help most mornings, priming her against the coming winter. Whatever happened at that hearing, Ruth intended to still own a boat worth keeping afloat when it was over. She spent afternoons with Corinne, reviewing the harbour grant and the filling station trust line by line, making sure every document was organised, certified, and beyond dispute. She spent evenings alone in the cabin, going through Wendell's old logbooks, the ones he'd kept for 40 years. Searching for any other clue her husband might have left her, she found one more thing. In the back pages of a logbook from 1979, a single line in Wendell's careful hand. Easy to miss, among decades of weather notes and catch counts. Paid HC share, Station Trust, in full. Told him, whatever happens to us, the girls come out even. Ruth read that line a dozen times before she understood it. HC, Harold Colby, her own father. Sometime in 1979, years before Ruth and Wendell had even married, the two men had settled some account between them. Some final piece of the arrangement. Wendell had written it down not for himself, but as a promise to a friend. Whatever happened to the two of them, their daughters would come out even. She still hadn't traced the second beneficiary's name. Corinne was working on it, but 60-year-old records didn't always cooperate. Ruth had decided, somewhere in the second week of waiting, to let that particular thread resolve itself in its own time. Some mysteries didn't need solving before the hearing to matter. Carl called once more before the hearing, his voice quieter than Ruth had heard in years. I talked to the seller in Augusta, he said. Told them the truth, that the estate might be more complicated than we thought. They gave me 2 more weeks before they walk from the deal and keep my deposit. I'm sorry, Carl, Ruth said, and meant it. Underneath everything, he was still her son. Still the boy who used to fall asleep in the wheelhouse on long summer evenings. Still someone she'd raised with the same 2 hands that had spliced 1,000 miles of rope. Are you, though? Carl asked. No accusation in it, just a genuine, exhausted question. Are you actually sorry, Mum? Or are you just saying it because that's what you say? Ruth thought about that carefully before she answered. Her son deserved the true answer, not the easy one. I'm sorry you're scared, she said. I'm sorry this is hard. I am not sorry that your father protected something for me, instead of leaving it exposed for anybody to take. Including, if I'm honest, including you and your sister, who handed it to me thinking it was worth $400 in scrap. Those are 2 different kinds of sorry, Carl. I think you're old enough to hear the difference. He was quite a long moment. Diane's still pushing her lawyer to reopen the whole division. He said finally, I told her I don't think it's going to work. I told her maybe we should just let it be what it is. That would be the wiser road, Ruth said. I know, Carl said. I'm working on being the kind of man who takes the wiser road, even when it cost him a house in Augusta. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was close enough to one. Ruth let herself hope quietly that whatever came out of that hearing room, she might not lose her son entirely. Not to a mistake made in a moment of grief and greed and bad math. The night before the hearing, Dale came down to the boat with 2 mugs of coffee and his folding stool, the same ritual he'd kept up nearly every week since the funeral. He sat across from Ruth on the freshly primed deck and looked at her a long moment before he spoke. You nervous? He asked. Some, Ruth admitted. Not about the facts. Corinne's got the facts locked down tighter than anything I've ever seen. I'm nervous about standing up in a room full of people who've known me 40 years, telling them, out loud, exactly what I'm worth. They already know what you're worth, Ruth, Dale said. This whole town's known it for years. You're the one who's been slow to say it. Ruth looked at him, this quiet man who had loved her husband the way a good apprentice loves a good teacher, who had shown up on her pier every week since the funeral, with nothing to gain and nothing to prove, just coffee and company, and the occasional hard truth delivered gently. Thank you, Dale, she said, for all of it. The mooring fee story, sitting with me in your shack when I couldn't hold the box steady, just showing up. Wendell showed up for me for 30 years before I ever thought to return the favour, Dale said. This isn't charity, Ruth. This is a debt finally getting paid the other direction. The hearing was held in the town hall's main room, usually reserved for budget votes and zoning disputes. Word had spread far enough that every folding chair in the building had been set out. Most of them were full a full 20 minutes before the meeting was called to order. Ruth recognised half the faces in that room. Fishermen, shopkeepers, the harbour's dwindling handful of working captains. People who'd known Wendell Pemberton for decades and had, in the last 3 weeks, apparently decided this particular Tuesday evening was worth showing up for. Carl and Diane sat together near the front, on the opposite side of the aisle from Ruth. Diane's lawyer had come too, a sharp young man in a good suit. He reminded Ruth uncomfortably of the one who'd drawn up the original estate papers. The town select board chair, a heavy-set man named Otis Farrow, who'd known Wendell since grade school, called the meeting to order. He read the agenda item aloud, dry and procedural. A motion to authorise sale of derelict harbour infrastructure along Wharf Street to Coastal Vista Development for an amount to be determined by appraisal. Before we proceed, Farrow said, I understand there's a competing claim on the property in question. Mrs. Pemberton, the floor is yours. Ruth stood. For one long moment she stood in front of a room full of people who'd known her most of her life. She felt every one of her 76 years settle into her spine. 51 years of marriage, 11 days of grief, 6 weeks of discovery, all arriving in her chest together. Then she thought of Wendell's voice on the pier, 10 years ago. Don't ever let them sell the boat separate from what floats under her. And she felt her spine straighten instead of bend. My name is Ruth Pemberton, she said. Her voice came out steady and clear enough to carry to the back row without a microphone. 40 years ago, my husband Wendell bought harbour rights to this stretch of pier and mooring field. He tied them by hull number to our boat, the Constance May. He recorded that grant properly with this town in 1961. He paid the mooring fee every single year without fail, even the last 2 years of his life when he was too sick to walk this pier himself. As long as that fee was paid, the grant stayed alive. And as long as the grant stayed alive, this property could never be sold out from under his family. No matter what happened to him, no matter who tried. She set the folded, certified copy of the grant on the podium in front of her. Beside it, the county recorded confirmation Peggy Duros had processed 2 weeks earlier. I have here the original 1961 grant, properly filed and recorded. I have confirmation from your own records office that the associated fees have been paid without interruption for 64 years. This property is not derelict, it is not unclaimed. It belongs by law and by my husband's deliberate design to whoever holds clear title to this boat's hull number. And that is me. The room had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of 100 people all doing the same arithmetic at once. Farrow leaned forward, studying the documents Corinne had already submitted for the record days earlier, cross-referencing them against something on his own laptop. When he looked up, his expression had the flat, careful look of a man about to say something that was going to matter. Mrs. Pemberton, he said, the town's council reviewed this grant last week. At my request, once we became aware of the competing claim. I'll say plainly for the record that council's opinion is this grant is valid and properly recorded. It takes precedence over any motion this board might pass tonight. The town has no legal standing to sell property. It does not, in fact, own. A murmur ran through the room, low and immediate. The sound of 100 people exhaling at once. Coastal Vista Development's representative stood up near the back. A young man in an expensive coat, he clearly hadn't anticipated needing to say anything at this meeting. He cleared his throat, the strangled politeness of a man watching a deal evaporate in real time. Was there any possibility, he asked, of negotiating directly with Mrs. Pemberton about a private sale? No, Ruth said, before Farrow could even open the floor to the question. This harbour isn't for sale. My husband spent his whole life making sure of that. I intend to spend the rest of mine keeping his promise. The room, unexpectedly, broke into applause. Ragged and genuine, fishermen and shopkeepers on their feet. Ruth stood at that podium and let herself, for the first time in 6 weeks, simply receive it. The recognition she'd spent 51 years never once asking for out loud. Diane's lawyer stood, cleared his throat, and asked to be heard on behalf of the family regarding the original estate division. Farrow, not unkindly, informed him that estate division disputes fell outside the scope of a town hall infrastructure hearing. They'd need to go through the appropriate probate channels. A sentence that landed in the room like a door, quietly but firmly closing. Ruth looked across the aisle at her children. Diane's face had gone pale and still. Carl was looking down at his own hands. When he finally looked up and met his mother's eyes, there was nothing left in his expression but exhausted, humbled clarity. The look of a man who'd finally run every number there was to run, and arrived, at last, at the true one. The motion to sell was withdrawn without a vote. The meeting adjourned 20 minutes later. Ruth Pemberton walked out of that town hall into the cold autumn evening, with Dale Prewitt on one side and Corinne Ashby on the other. Behind her, the sound of a whole room of people who'd known her husband and had finally tonight truly seen his wife. A week after the hearing, Corinne asked Ruth to come back into the Millbridge office. this time to lay out plainly and completely what had changed and what hadn't. A woman ought to know the full shape of her own life before she decides what to do with it. Let's start with what stayed the same, Corinne said, spreading the familiar folders across her desk. The house on Larch Street, $311,000, still Carl's. The joint savings, $68,000, still split between Carl and Diane. Diane's truck, $31,000. None of that moved. None of that was ever going to move, hearing or no hearing. I never wanted it to, Ruth said. I know. I'm establishing it so what comes next makes sense by comparison. Corinne tapped the second folder, the Harbour grant. Final appraisal, $840,000. Confirmed and recorded in your name alone as of last Thursday. The filling station trust, once the interchange easement clears next spring, somewhere between 1.8 and 2.3 million, split evenly between you and Louise Hartwell. Ruth did the arithmetic slowly, the way she always did, out loud. Numbers only ever felt real to her once she'd said them into a room. So somewhere close to $3 million, all told, on top of what they'd already split. That's the shape of it, Corinne confirmed. And 31 years of mooring fees, Ruth said. What did that come to exactly? Corinne checked the ledger page. $10,400, paid in cash without a single missed year, going back to when the town started keeping the records digitally. Likely more before that. We just don't have receipts that old. Dale, sitting quietly in the corner chair where he'd taken to accompanying Ruth on these visits, shook his head slowly. $10,000, he said, to protect 840. Man ran the numbers before either of us ever thought to ask him to. He ran a lot of numbers nobody ever saw, Ruth said. That was always Wendell. Quiet arithmetic instead of loud declarations. Corinne closed the folders gently. There's one more figure you should have for your own records, she said. Legal fees, mine included, court costs, the recording fees at the town office, the appraisal costs. All told, $4,200. In 22 years practicing this kind of law, I'd say that's about as cheap as $3 million has ever been secured. Ruth almost laughed at that. The plain, unglamorous absurdity of it. A lifetime's fortune protected for the cost of a decent used car. She thought, not for the first time, that her husband would have appreciated the arithmetic more than almost anything else this whole strange season. What do I do with all of it, Corinne? She asked. I've never in 51 years had to think about a sum like this. That, Corinne said, is entirely your decision to make. I'd encourage you to take your time making it. Money like this doesn't need to be spent quickly to matter. Sometimes it matters more, spent slowly, by someone who actually understands what it costs to protect. Ruth thought about that all the way back to Belhaven. Dale drove. The two of them stayed quiet for most of the ride. The harbour came into view at last as the road curved down toward Wharf Street. The Constance May was visible even from a distance, her hull scraped bare. Within a month, fresh paint would turn her from a wreck into something else. A boat that carried, quite literally, everything her husband had ever built. You know what I keep thinking, Ruth said as Dale pulled the truck into the harbour lot. What's that? Carl and Diane fought over $410,000. Like it was the whole world, Ruth said. They never once thought to ask what a boat with a good name might actually be worth. I spent 51 years married to a man who understood the difference between a number and a value. I don't think I fully understood it myself, not until I was 76 years old, kneeling in a fish hole with a pry bar in my hand. Better late than never, Dale said. Wendell used to say that exact thing, Ruth said, usually right before he fixed something everybody else had already given up on. She got out of the truck and walked down the pier toward her boat, the cold autumn air sharp in her lungs. For the first time since Carl slid those registration papers across her kitchen table, she let herself think about it honestly, about everything that money could still become in careful, patient hands. The weeks after the hearing settled into a different kind of quiet. Not the brittle, waiting quiet of a widow alone on a boat. The fuller quiet of a woman whose life had finally caught up to what it was actually worth. Corinne finished tracing the filling station trust's second beneficiary 2 weeks after the hearing. The answer surprised Ruth less than she expected. The name belonged to a woman named Louise Colby Hartwell, Ruth's own second cousin. A woman Ruth had met perhaps 3 times in her life, at family funerals decades apart, now living quietly in a retirement community outside Portland. She had no idea her grandfather's old business partner had spent 60 years protecting her share of a filling station property alongside Ruth's own. Ruth drove down to meet her on a grey Tuesday in November, carrying the partnership agreement and the trust documents. She found a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 80s. Louise cried briefly and without embarrassment when Ruth explained what her own father and Amos Pemberton had quietly built together 67 years earlier. "Nobody ever told me," Louise said. "Not one word my whole life." "Nobody told me either," Ruth said. "I think that might have been the point. Some things only survive by staying quiet long enough for the people trying to take them to lose interest." They split the trust's proceeds evenly, once the interchange easement was finalised and the county's payments came through the following spring. Ruth used her half to do 3 things her husband would have approved of, and one thing he never could have imagined. He'd died before he ever saw the harbour grant finish paying off the debt of 2 families, ruined by the same road 60 years apart. She paid off Dale's mortgage on his small house above the harbour, quietly through Corinne, with no note attached and no name on the payment. Dale Prewitt had shown up for her every single week since Wendell's funeral, asking for nothing. Ruth understood, better than most, the particular power of a kindness that arrives with no name attached. She had the Constance May fully restored. Hull painted a deep, honest blue. Her name got repainted in gold letters across the transom by a sign painter Dale recommended, a man who'd known Wendell well enough to get the lettering right on the first attempt. She endowed a small scholarship at the county's Maritime Trade School, funded permanently through the Harbour Grant's ongoing lease income, for young people from working waterfront families who wanted to learn a trade the way she and Wendell had learned theirs. Hands-on, unglamorous, durable. And she forgave Carl the $20,000 he'd lost on the collapsed house deal in Augusta. Not all at once, not as a grand gesture at a family dinner, but slowly, the way real forgiveness usually arrives. A cheque quietly deposited into his account the same month he finally sat down with her. He admitted, without being asked, that he'd been wrong to hand her a boat and call it a favour. "I thought I was doing you a kindness," Carl told her. The 2 of them sat on the newly painted deck on a cold, clear afternoon the following spring. "Taking the useless thing off your hands so you wouldn't have to deal with it. You were doing yourself a kindness," Ruth said. "Not unkindly. You just didn't know it yet. I know it now. I know you do." She didn't tell him everything was forgiven, because it wasn't. Not entirely, not yet. Ruth had learned enough in 76 years to know that trust rebuilds itself in small, honest increments, or not at all. But she let him help her varnish the wheelhouse trim that afternoon. The 2 of them worked in comfortable silence, the way she used to work beside Wendell. When he left that evening, he hugged her at the top of the pier. A real hug, the kind he hadn't given her since he was young enough to climb into the wheelhouse and pretend to steer. Diane took longer. Her lawyer's attempt to reopen the estate division had gone nowhere, exactly as Corinne predicted. For a while afterward, Diane kept a careful, wounded distance from her mother, the distance of a woman who'd bet on the wrong number and was still learning how to sit with the consequences. It was Louise Hartwell, of all people, who eventually softened that distance. She sent Diane an unexpected letter about her own grandfather and Amos Pemberton, about the strange, patient loyalty 2 ruined men had shown each other across 60 years. A story Diane had never heard because nobody in her own family had ever bothered to tell it to her. Diane called her mother the week after she read that letter, her voice smaller than Ruth had heard it in years. "I never knew any of that," Diane said. "About Grandpa Colby, about what he and Wendell's father built." "Neither did I until 6 months ago," Ruth said. "I'm sorry, Mum. For the boat, for the lawyer, for all of it." "I know," Ruth said. And found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it when she said the next part too. "I forgive you, Diane. Not because you've earned it yet, because carrying the alternative is heavier than I want to spend the rest of my life lifting." It was not, Ruth reflected afterward, the reunion a movie would have written. No tearful embrace at the pier's edge, no instant restoration of everything that had cracked in that kitchen 6 months earlier. But Diane started calling every Sunday after that. Small calls, careful ones, the kind that rebuild something slowly, instead of declaring it fixed all at once. Ruth found she preferred it that way. Real things took time. She'd learned that from a man who took 60 years to finish protecting the people he loved. Winnie from Ackley's closed the bait shop early one Saturday that winter. She came down the pier with a thermos of coffee, the same as nearly every week since the day Ruth first moved aboard. The two women sat together in the cockpit, watching a fresh coat of snow settle soft and quiet over the harbour. "Whoever left you that first envelope," Ruth said, "the coffee and the $20, back when I first moved onto this boat. I never did find out who it was." "Some things aren't meant to be found out," Winnie said. "My grandfather used to say a kindness with a name attached stops being a kindness. It starts being a transaction. Whoever it was, I'd guess they're satisfied just knowing it landed where it was supposed to." Ruth thought about that long while, the snow ticking softly against the cabin windows. Maybe this was the truest thing anyone had told her all year. Truer even than the numbers Corinne laid out on her desk. Truer than the applause in that town hall room. Some debts get repaid forward instead of back. Some love only works if nobody ever asks to be thanked for it. "I'm glad you kept coming down here," Ruth said, "even before anybody knew what I was sitting on." "I'd have kept coming regardless," Winnie said. "Some people are worth the walk down the pier, whether they've got $3 million under their floorboards or 400 in scrap value. You were always going to be one of those people, Ruth. The money just made the rest of the world finally catch up to what a few of us already knew. The Maritime Trade School Scholarship took its first recipient the following September, a 19-year-old named Casey Whitlow. Her father had fished out of Belhaven for 20 years before a bad hip put him ashore for good. Her family couldn't otherwise have afforded the $2,600 it cost to enroll in the marine mechanics program that year. Ruth met her at the scholarship dinner the school held every fall, a modest affair in a community hall, folding tables and a sheet cake, nothing like the fundraising galas wealthier philanthropies might throw. Ruth was glad of that. Glad the money went toward diesel engines and hull repair certifications, not the appearance of generosity. "Mrs. Pemberton?" Casey asked, approaching her table. The particular nervousness of a young person meeting someone whose name is attached to a check that changed their life. "I wanted to say thank you. I didn't think I was going to be able to do this program at all." "What made you want to do it?" Ruth asked. "My dad," Casey said. "He always said the water doesn't care what your last name is or how much money you've got. It only cares whether you know what you're doing. I wanted to actually know what I'm doing." Ruth thought of Wendell. He'd said some version of that same sentence more times than she could count, across 51 years. Something warm settled in her chest that had nothing to do with the money at all. "Your father's right," Ruth said. "And for what it's worth, Casey, the man whose name isn't on this scholarship but ought to be would have liked you a great deal." "Whose name is that?" "My husband's," Ruth said. "He never got the chance to meet you. But he spent his whole life making sure people like you would have a chance, even if he never lived to see a single one of you walk through that door." Casey didn't fully understand the weight of that sentence. Not yet. She was 19, freshly arrived at the beginning of her own working life. But she thanked Ruth again, sincerely. She walked back to a table of other young people who'd all been given a foothold they might not otherwise have found. Ruth thought this was the truest form the inheritance had ever taken. More than the boat's fresh paint. More than the harbour grant recorded properly at the town office. Carl came to that same dinner, the first public event he'd attended with his mother since the hearing. He stood a little awkwardly near the back of the hall. His coat looked like it cost more than anyone else's in the room. Ruth found him afterward, alone by the coffee urn, watching the scholarship recipients laugh together at their table. "I didn't know it would look like this," Carl said, when his mother approached. "I pictured something bigger. Grander." "It doesn't need to be grand," Ruth said. "It needs to be useful. Your father understood that better than almost anyone I ever knew." Carl watched Casey explain something animatedly to the boy beside her. Both of them clearly excited about a program that would let them spend their days elbow deep in marine engines, instead of worrying how to pay for the privilege. "I've been thinking," Carl said slowly, "about starting a small fund myself. At work, nothing like what you've built. Just something for the guys on the crew whose kids want trade school instead of a 4-year university, and can't quite make the numbers work." "That sounds like something your father would have liked very much," Ruth said. "I keep thinking about what you said," Carl admitted, "about the difference between sorry you're scared and sorry for what happened. I think the second kind is the one that actually costs you something. The first kind's just relief dressed up as an apology." Ruth looked at her son a long moment. This man who had once slid a boat's registration papers across a kitchen table, like he was doing his mother a kindness. She saw something for the first time in longer than she could remember that looked genuinely like his father in him. Not the surface resemblance, the jawline, the quiet way of standing, the deeper kind. The part of Wendell that built things quietly instead of announcing them. "I'm proud of you for thinking that," Ruth said. "Not because it undoes anything, because it's a start." "Is a start enough?" Carl asked. "It was enough for your father," Ruth said. 67 years of a start, one careful piece at a time, and look what it became. A start is usually exactly enough, Carl, as long as you keep adding to it. He hugged her then, in the middle of a community hall full of paper streamers and a sheet cake half eaten. It was not a grand reconciliation. No Hollywood ending, no swelling music, no forgiveness declared complete. But it was real and honest. Watching him walk back to his car afterward, Ruth thought it was exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous rebuilding. The kind her husband would have recognised as the truest kind there was. Diane called that same week. She asked if she could bring her own daughter, Ruth's granddaughter, 7-year-old Maddie, down to see the boat before winter set in properly. Ruth hadn't seen much of Maddie in 2 years. The divorce and the estate dispute had put a careful distance between the branches of the family. She said yes before Diane even finished asking. Maddie arrived bundled in a puffy pink coat, wide-eyed at the boats bobbing in the harbour. She climbed into the wheelhouse the exact same way Carl and Diane both had, decades earlier. Small hands gripping the wheel like it was the most important job in the world. "Is this really Grandpa's boat?" Maddie asked. "It's my boat now," Ruth said. "But yes, it was your grandfather's for a long time before that. Why's it got a lady's name on it instead of his?" Ruth smiled at that. She knelt down beside her granddaughter in the small wheelhouse. The gold letters of Constance May were visible through the window behind them, catching the low autumn light. "That was his mother's name," she said. "Your great-great-grandmother. Your grandfather said a boat that already knows who she is doesn't need renaming. I think that's true of people too, Maddie. Sometimes the name you're born with already carries everything you need." Maddie considered that with the particular seriousness only a 7-year-old brings to a question about boat names. Then, with no transition at all, she asked if she could steer the boat for real sometime. Ruth told her yes, when she was a little older and the water was a little calmer. Privately, she thought this was Wendell's too. This small girl asking to learn the wheel the same way Ruth herself had asked, 54 years earlier, on a Saturday past the breakwater. With a man who couldn't dance and didn't talk much. A man who'd built her an entire life out of things he never once said out loud. The town itself changed a little too, in the months after the hearing. Small ways nobody had exactly planned, but everybody seemed to welcome. Otis Farrow proposed a permanent line item in the town budget for harbour infrastructure maintenance. The Select Board approved it. The first real money the pier had seen from the town in over a decade. People called it, informally, though never officially, the Pemberton Fund. Half the room had watched Ruth Pemberton stand up and prove a working harbour was worth more than any developer's appraisal. Dale got a raise he'd never once asked for, and a title, Harbour Superintendent, that finally matched 30 years of work he'd been doing under a much smaller name. He kept the folding stool anyway. Some habits Ruth had come to understand were worth keeping exactly as they were. Louise Hartwell drove up from Portland twice that first year. Once in the spring to see the restored filling station site before the interchange construction crews arrived. Once in the fall, just to sit on the deck with her newfound cousin and talk about two fathers. Two men who had quietly protected their daughters across 60 years, neither of them lived to see fully play out. "Do you think they knew?" Louise asked on that second visit, watching the harbour go gold in the late afternoon light. "That it would take this long? That we'd only find out after they were both gone?" "I think," Ruth said slowly, "they knew exactly what they were building. And they trusted the building to outlast the explaining. Some things only hold up if you don't spend them arguing about who deserves them." Louise nodded at that, quiet for a while. Then she asked the question Ruth had been waiting for since the day they met. "What do we do with what's left once the county pays out?" "We keep building," Ruth said. "The way they did. Quiet. For people who'll need it long after we're both gone too." That was the spirit behind the Maritime Scholarship, as it grew. funded now not just from the harbour grant's lease income, but from a portion of the filling station settlement too. Both cousins put their names to something meant to outlast them, the same patient way their fathers had. It was almost exactly a year since Carl slid those registration papers across her kitchen table. On a clear October evening, Ruth stood alone on the newly painted deck. The sun went down golden low over the Sound. The whole harbour sat quiet around her. 11 working boats moored safe, in a mooring field that would never again be sold out from under any of them. Dale came down the pier, the way he did most evenings now. 2 mugs of coffee in hand, he sat on his folding stool across from her without needing an invitation. Anniversary of sorts, Dale said. Year ago tonight, more or less. You moved onto this boat with 1 suitcase and no idea what you were sitting on. Feels longer, Ruth said. Feels shorter too. Both somehow. That's grief for you, Dale said, and love. They both do that to time. Ruth looked down the length of the deck, at the gold letters catching the last of the light. Constance May, a name her husband had refused to change, because he said a boat that already knew who she was didn't need renaming. She thought about a man who'd spent his whole life protecting the people he loved, by staying almost entirely silent about it, who'd paid a mooring fee in cash. Every February for 2 years he could barely walk, who'd scratched 6 words into a metal tag, trusting his wife to understand them, even if he never lived to explain them himself. It was never about the money, Ruth said quietly, mostly to herself. No, Dale agreed. It never is, with the ones worth having. She raised her coffee mug toward the 11 boats bobbing in the last light. The Constance May rocked against her mooring, gold letters glowing in the dusk.